So I'm going to talk about what goes on at what went on at Bletchley Park during World War II, a bit of the background to it. I'm going to get a bit more technical than I do to different audiences because I assume you people are a wee bit more technical. But the human side of it, the thing which seems to interest most people and the mystery of Bletchley Park is the secrecy because of it was kept quiet for so many years. And even today, there's quite a lot of stuff that, believe it or not, is still classified, even though World War II ended an awful long time ago. This was given to me by a veteran. She signed it in 1944, still requiring people to be secret. And we hear lots of stories which reflects the secrecy. I guess my favorite was several years ago, I interviewed an elderly lady. She was a veteran, came to Bletchley Park with her 68-year-old daughter. Talking to her, it was clear she'd worked on Japanese codes and ciphers during the war. Most of the people who did that work were given a crash course in Japanese. So I asked her whether she still spoke Japanese, and she said, oh yes, and said a few words in Japanese. And I looked at her daughter, who had a look of complete astonishment on her face. She clearly had no idea her mother spoke a word of Japanese. And she looked at her mother and said, Mom, why didn't you ever say anything? And the woman said, well, it was over 70 years ago. You're only 68. Why would I have said anything? So there are a lot of people that have never said anything. Equally, there are people that are more than happy to tell you what they did during the war. Now, during World War II, Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, not 50 miles from here, was the home of an organization called the Government Code and Cipher School. It was a name dreamt up by a chap in the Foreign Office, and they tended to refer to themselves as GC&CS. November 1939, there was a bit of a problem. There was no signage. Nobody could find the place, particularly delivery vehicles trying to find the place. So one day, end of November 1939, a big sign appeared outside the main gate, which simply said Government Communication Headquarters. Didn't mean anything, but local people knew it was some sort of wartime government facility and delivery vehicles could find the place. But the name stuck, along with its abbreviation GCHQ. They actually started to refer to themselves as that towards the end of the war. Then the new organization, GCHQ, born out of GC&CS, was based initially at Bletchley Park, moved to North London and East Coast, ended up where it resides today, Cheltenham Government Communication Headquarters. And by many accounts, what went on at Bletchley Park during World War II helped shorten the war by some considerable period. I think the most important word in that sentence is helped. I'm afraid too many so-called experts who should know better frequently say Bletchley Park shortened World War II, typically by 2 years. Intelligence does not shorten wars. It helps military commanders do their work. I prefer to quote General Eisenhower, head of the Allied forces during World War II in Europe, later President Eisenhower, who wrote to this gentleman, Stuart Menges, who was head of the Secret Intelligence Services, latter part of the war. That letter, which is actually on display at Bletchley Park today, says that the work at Bletchley Park helped rout the enemy, bring the war to a swift conclusion, and save countless lives. That's probably a much better description rather than trying to put a number on years shortened or lives saved. Now, the story of Bletchley Park starts at the end of the 19th century with the invention of wireless radio. Probably in the mid-19th century, telecommunication cables were laid in the English Channel and other waterways around the world. Most countries used these cables to communicate. Recognizing that, in August 1914, at the beginning of World War I, Britain sent a ship out into the Channel, pulled up 5 cables used by Germany, cut them, reeled in the cable, and pretty much severed Germany's telecommunication links to Europe. The Germans equally damaged some British cable networks and cut off British links to India. So increasingly, both countries turned to the fairly new technology of wireless radio. A number of people claim credit for wireless radio. I guess Marconi, the best known, at the end of the 19th century. And most countries started using it. The distances by which you could transmit got further and further, and Morse code was adopted as an international standard. And well, it looks like we don't have any audio. That should be going beep, 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 so I won't worry too much about that. The trouble with wireless radio, it's a broadcast medium. So if you want your transmissions to be secret, you have a problem because you know that anybody with the right equipment can intercept and read them. That's where this idea of encryption comes in. Countries looking for ways of disguising their operational or strategic communications. A machine started to appear at the end of World War I, and this gentleman is a key figure. in this development, Arthur Scherbius, because he acquired a patent for a device and he gave it the name Enigma. It was a commercial machine. Scherbius' idea was that it would sell well in the banking industry. Interestingly, here's his application for a patent in London in 1925. If you had the money, you could go to Germany and buy one. In fact, the deputy head of the Government Code and Cipher School, Edward Travis, bought one in Berlin in 1926 and brought it back to Britain. So it was commercially available. Enigma's become a bit like Hoover. You may have a Dyson vacuum cleaner at home and refer to it as the Hoover. Everyone seems to call every encryption device in this period Enigma, but there were lots of different devices. And there were lots of different Enigma variations, as you can see, starting off with the very early machines. The Enigma I is the more familiar machine, which was adopted by the German military. But Hagelin also made machines, Siemens and Holst, and the famous Lorenz machine, which I'll be saying a bit about later. So lots of different companies were involved in this. But it was the Scherbius machine that was adopted by the German military forces. Gradually, they started adopting it and making it more secure. And that's the standard machine that people are familiar with. Just a slight note, this is definitely a naval machine because there are letters around the wheels. Almost in most cases, the Army and Air Force put numbers around the rings around the wheels. The German Navy letters, I have no idea why. 26 positions, but that's how you can tell one from the other. But all branches of the German military apparatus during World War II used variations of Enigma, modified them, and in fact it was the reading of the German railway Enigma early in the war which gave the British government the first indication of the true core of the Holocaust. Numbers of messages being read, clearly showing large numbers of people being transported by train to locations in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany, the concentration camps. Now, the Government Code and Cipher School itself was actually set up in 1919 at the end of World War I. World War I, Britain had two separate groups doing this work. The Naval Group, Admiralty Group, rather strange name, Room 40 OB. Very simple explanation. They were based in room number 40 of the old building of the Admiralty. MI-1B, maybe you can guess that stands for Military Intelligence 1B. They were merged, and Alistair Denniston, who worked in room 40, was appointed operational director. And they worked under the auspices of the Admiralty in London. But after 2 or 3 years of operation, it was clear that all the work they were doing was really just dealing with diplomatic and commercial wireless traffic. So in early 23, the decision was taken to move it into the Foreign Office. This gentleman, Admiral Hugh Sinclair, who was head of the Secret Intelligence Services, was given the role of director. Denison remained as operational director, reporting to him. So those were the arrangements in 1923, and obviously it was overseen by the Foreign Secretary of the time, Lord Curzon. Now by probably throughout the 1930s, Sinclair, the head of SI, the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and GC&CS, became concerned that all this intelligence activity that he was responsible for was taking place in the middle of London. In the event of war, not a very good location, so he started to look for somewhere outside of London to establish a war station for intelligence activity. He found Bletchley Park, 50-odd miles from London, in around 1937. It had been the family home, a gentleman's country residence for this guy, Sir Herbert Lyon, a wealthy London banker. 581-acre estate. It had all been sold off after Sir Herbert and his wife had died. 581 acres auctioned off. What was left was 55 acres, which Sinclair initially leased, and then he purchased the property, paid £6,000 in June 1938 for 55 acres of prime Buckinghamshire real estate. Now in 1938, Alistair Denniston recognized that he needed to grow his organization, so he sent two gentlemen around universities, particularly Oxford and Cambridge, identifying people who had the right skills and agreed in the event of war to undertake secret work for the Foreign Office. That's all they were told. The list, Denniston always referred to it as men of the professor type. Two rather interesting names on that list, A.M. Turing and W.G. Welshman, both from Cambridge, probably the two key people in the success of Bletchley Park, but more of them later. There was another interesting name on that list, J.R.R. Tolkien. He never actually came to Bletchley Park. One assumes he went back to Oxford and wrote Lord of the Rings instead. Now, in August 38, it was felt that they had enough infrastructure in place. They immediately, Sinclair had sent telecommunication engineers. They wired up the site. etc. And in 38, they felt they had enough in place, so he ordered a dress rehearsal. 20 or 30 members of the government code and cipher school, a few people from the secret intelligence services started working in this old mansion house at Bletchley Park. Now, they needed a cover story. The property had been empty for a while. Local people would wonder who they were. They were all housed in hotels and inns in the local area. The gentleman who'd organized the move to Bletchley Park was an MI6 officer called Captain Ridley. So the story that was put about was that this group was Captain Ridley's shooting party. A group of wealthy people come out to the countryside to hunt and shoot and fish. Not a very good cover story. I doubt if any of them were ever seen with muddy wellies or shotguns, but that was the story that was used until September 1938, when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from the Munich conference, waving his famous bit of white paper and uttering the mortal words, "I believe it is peace for our time." So the government code and cipher school returned to London, but MI6 clearly believed war was imminent, so they carried on developing the site. And on August 15th, 1939, Sinclair ordered mobilization and all of his groups of intelligence people to start the move to Bletchley Park. And if you'd walked into Bletchley Park to work in August 1939, this is what you'd walked into, because nothing had really changed. They'd put in telecommunication infrastructure in the old mansion house. It was a beautiful country residence. This thing's called a haw-haw. They even had a maze. If you'd walked it through the gates, 2 or 3 years later, you would have walked into a building site. This picture was taken in 1944, aerial shot. You suddenly see these massive concrete brick steel reinforced buildings. These are RAF and Army encampments. They ran out of local accommodation, and all the famous wooden huts. It's huge. There are 8 of these buildings. This one here, Block F, was knocked down in the 1980s. Most of the other steel reinforced brick ones stand to this day. And this shows you how quickly the site developed. And you can see this huge expansion in 1943 with these massive buildings. This one here is 60,000 square feet, quite a large building. Massive development as we get towards the end of the war. Now, the phony war, Britain did declare war, but there was a period called the phony war. But once Germany started invading, particularly Holland and Belgium, suddenly things started, the wireless radio traffic started to increase dramatically. During the Battle of France, this rather august gentleman is General Heinz Guderian, head of the German Panzer Divisions. Here he is during the Battle of France, June 1939, in his mobile communication vehicle, his Enigma machine. Note, 3 operators. Enigma was a very expensive system to use, typically 3 people to send a message, typically 200 characters long, 3 people to decrypt it. Very, very expensive. One chap presses the keys, one chap writes letters down, and the other one's a radio operator. Very expensive indeed. But clearly, they started to use it on a large scale. Recognizing that, an organization was created in Britain called the Y Service. It actually stands for Wireless Intercept. It tends to be written like that. Strategic locations around Britain, the main Army intercept station, Chicksands, which still exists as a museum, an RAF base. You can still go there and see it. In the Far East, I was in Malta last week, and you can go down and you can visit the war rooms in Malta, intercept station Malta, Cairo, Gibraltar. All this traffic being intercepted and coming in to Bletchley Park. Now, the German Army and Air Force messages looked a bit like this. They consisted of this sort of stuff. There was all this unencrypted stuff at the beginning of the message. And then typically the encrypted text came in 5-letter groupings. Probably the reason for that is so that they didn't give any fixed word lengths away. They did it like that. German Naval Enigma was in 4-letter groupings rather than 5. Typically when they came into Bletchley Park, they were written on these red forms like this. If the intercept operator had missed a letter, they tended to just put a dash if it missed the letter. And this is what the cryptanalyst would receive. Now, the Enigma system is quite interesting. The Enigma machine would be set up by the German Army and Air Force every day at midnight Greenwich Mean Time. So the setting changed every day at midnight. The daily setting was known as the daily key. One assumes that's where words like things like encryption key and security key come from. I'm not aware of the use of key in this context before Bletchley Park. In case the German Army and Air Force, typically a box of 5 wheels were available, of which they would choose 3 and put them in a predefined orders. There are 60 ways you can do that. I won't make you do the maths. There was this plug board at the front that they'd added. Typically they plugged together 10 pairs of letters. You can see the huge number of possibilities there. And then there was a detachable ring around the wheel, which could be set to one of 26 positions. And you can see the number of possibilities. So if you multiply those three numbers together, this is the standard number quoted. The number of ways the Enigma machine could be set up. The key space, if you're a modern cyber person, 158.9 million possibilities. Now the way it works is very simple. Here's a German phrase. The sending operator types it into his machine. It gets encrypted. Here's it encrypted. It then gets transmitted in Morse code. The receiving operator types what he receives, and back comes the plain text, because Enigma is a symmetrical system. Encryption and decryption are the same. On one machine, if you type A, and another machine is set up identically, you type A and it turns it into B. On a machine set up identically, if you type B, it turns it into A. Very nice machine. It only works if sender and receiver have their machine set up exactly the same way. Now, when they arrived at Bletchley Park on August 39, there was a very small code-breaking team led by a veteran World War I codebreaker by the name of Dilly Knox. They moved into this building, which you can still see at Bletchley Park, called the Cottage. This is where Knox's team was based. Now, Knox was not a technical man. He was actually a Greek scholar from King's College, Cambridge. He'd been in room 40 in World War I, a very quirky, brilliant chap, but he was not a technical man. He had great success at breaking the early versions of Enigma, but once the German Army, Air Force, and Navy started adopting it, particularly by the time you get to Enigma I, Knox was getting nowhere. He was making no progress with it whatsoever. Fortunately, they got help from Poland. The Poles had set up a cipher bureau in Warsaw, 1919, and the Poles were the first to recognize that the age of machine cryptography had arrived, and the best people to tackle it were probably not Greek scholars from King's College, Cambridge, but mathematicians. They put on a course at the University of Poznan, and at the end of 1932, they recruited these three gentlemen, and these are the gentlemen that made the early breakthroughs into the Enigma machine. Now, they had a bit of help because this gentleman, Hans-Hilo Schmidt, worked in the German Ministry of Information, and he provided French intelligence with lots of information about the Enigma machine, which this chap Bertrand passed to the Poles. Eventually, a meeting was held. French intelligence organized it in July 1939, just before Poland was invaded. All the key people took part: Dennison and Knox, Humphrey Sandwith, never seen a picture of him. He was the head of the Admiralty's wireless intercept service. All the Polish, these are the two guys who ran, Guido Langer and Maximilian Schiałowski, actually ran the Polish Cipher Bureau, the three young Poles, two French intelligence officers. And at that meeting, much to the astonishment of the British, the Poles revealed everything. They've been intercepting and reading and read Enigma encrypted messages since probably 1933, and they even built machines to help with it. Now, one of the problems with the Enigma machine is that even if you know the daily setting or the daily key, and the British did capture the sheets, they tended to circulate them monthly, the monthly settings. In the case of the German Army and Air Force, the sending operator made one final adjustment to the machine. He was allowed to turn the wheels letter by letter so he could choose the starting position of the machine before he started encrypting the message. This was called the message setting. Now clearly he needed to tell everyone he was communicating with which three letters he chose so they could make the same setting so the machines were identical. They needed a procedure to do that, and that's where their problems started. So this is the procedure before May 1940, and this was the basis. It was flawed in the basis in which the Poles broke Enigma. The operator, here's a typical setting sheet with a month settings. Here's day one, which wheels to use, this thing called a ring setting, all the plug connections at the front. The operator sets his machine up. Now, if you remember from the previous slide, I'm going to encrypt the letter at the position A, B, D. I need to tell everybody who I'm communicating with that they need to set their machine to A, B, D. This is the way they did it. The operator would choose at random another three letters, say in this case VIN, and turn the wheels to VIN. He would then encrypt ABD twice. Note twice. In this case, WQS, and then the second time it's turned into the EUP. And then in the body of the message, they would put VIN, and they would hide these 6 letters in the body of the encrypted text. The receiving operator sets his wheels to VIN, types WQS EUP, back comes ABD, ABD. He then sets his wheels to ABD, and his machine is the same. Presumably the reason for doing it twice, in case letters were lost in transmission. But those of you involved in this sort of stuff know it's a big mistake to do anything twice in a row. In cryptography, it creates patterns which the Poles exploited, and that is how they cracked Enigma in the 1920s, and they built various technologies to help with it. Note the name Bomba, because that's part of the story a bit later on. Now, September 3rd, 1939, Britain declared war against Poland, and the following day, these two gentlemen arrived who were on the list I pointed out before, Alan Turing and Gordon Welshman, two key figures in the story of Bletchley Park. And they were initially signed to this chap, Dilly Knox. Now, Welshman, after several weeks, immediately started to realize that the approach of the World War I codebreakers simply wouldn't work. One man dealing with one message at a time and trying to decrypt it, translate it, analyze it, deciding whether it contained any useful intelligence. He said they needed a production line approach, and he drew up a plan exactly as you see. Every message that came in was registered. You would then pass it to a control room that was talking to the intercept stations, telling them which traffic they wanted to prioritize. Obviously, during the Battle of Britain, they were most interested in what the German Air Force were doing, and they wanted their messages. Then these are the rooms, I won't go into any detail, which actually worked out the daily setting. Once they'd worked out the daily setting or the daily key, they would put it into the decoding room where they had replica Enigma machines. They would decrypt the messages and then pass them to an entirely different section to translate them and produce the intelligence, which was known as Ultra. A lovely production line approach. Welshman drew up a plan. He presented it to the people that ran Bletchley Park, and it was adopted almost straight away. Initially, they started off with German Army and Air Force. They then used exactly the same system for the German Navy. And if you go to Bletchley Park today, you see the wooden huts. Interestingly, what they did was Welshman was asked to head up the production section to work on German Army and Air Force. They moved into a wooden building, which happened to be Hut number 6. So they took Hut 6 as a departmental name. So when they moved out of Hut 6 to a bigger building, they still called themselves Hut 6. So Hut 6 had to be renumbered to Hut 16. As the numbering is really quite confusing. Hut 3 translated and analyzed. Not surprisingly, when Hut 3 moved on, they renamed it to 23 because nobody would work in Hut 13. Naval Enigma, Hut 8 and Hut 4, and these huts are all standing today at Bletchley Park. Here's a wartime picture, a very rare picture of Hut 6 and 3 taken during the war. And here's what it looks like today, beautifully restored. The hut's completely restored internally, so you can actually get a feel for what it was like during the war. And here are the people who actually did the work. People like Turing and Welshman to maybe a lesser extent. Some people have heard of Dilly Knox, are the best known figures, but these are the real people. These are the real cryptanalysts. These are the guys that actually did the work. Dennis Babbage, also from Sydney, Sussex, he'd been recruited by Welshman along with David Rees. John Herval was a student of Welshman's. Welshman recruited a lot of the early people, brilliant mathematicians. Babbage and Rees went on to significant careers after the war in math. Herval maybe less so. Reg Parker was a banker. It was found that bankers were very good at the administration side of things. I've met the families of most of these people. Parker never ever spoke about what he did at Bletchley Park. Either did Rees or Babbage. Never spoke about it at all. This is the replica Enigma. The British looked at the Enigma system in the 1920s. They decided it wasn't secure enough, so two gentlemen in the RAF designed this thing called the Type X, 5 encryption wheels. Unlike the Enigma, where you press a key and a letter lights up, on this thing you type on a much better keyboard, and on strips of paper, out come what you type, and on this side of the machine, out comes the German text. And so the operator has that, types it into the Type X machine, out comes these strips of German, they stick it on sheets, hand them to the translators and analyzers, and if you speak any German, you can see here, this is a real wartime example. Someone has gone through with pen and has identified German words, because they are in 5-letter group. It's not very difficult to do. Now, there was a problem, because the people of Bletchley Park knew that the mistake, the double encryption of the message setting that the Poles had exploited, it was such an obvious mistake, they knew that the Germans would recognize it, and they did. At the beginning of May 1940, they stopped the double encryption. All they would do is they would encrypt it once, and then in the body of the message, here would be this indicator setting and the encrypted message setting. They spotted this quite early on because they noticed that there was an extra 3 characters in the preamble. and they knew that they had changed it. It didn't take them very long to work it out. But it meant that at a stroke, the Polish technology no longer worked, and they needed to come up with their own methods of solution. Now, at the same time, probably in some point in 1940, Alan Turing was asked to get involved in Naval Enigma, and they started to set up a concentrated attack. Here's a rare wartime photograph of Hut 8, where Turing was based. I suspect someone was taking a photograph of the car, and Hut 8 happened to be in the background. Here's Hut 8 as it looks today, except it looks different now because all the wooden huts had bomb blast walls around them, and they have just rebuilt the bomb blast wall, so there's a wall around this now. And here are some of the key people in Hut 8. Obviously, Turing. Turing was at Bletchley Park from the beginning of the war. He went to America in November 42, came back in March 43, but ended up at a place called Hounslow Park working on phone scrambler systems. So he wasn't here throughout the war. The guy who really ran Hut 8 was Hugh Alexander, British chess champion in 1938. Rolf Nosquith is still alive to this day, 97, still walks around unaided. And Joan Clark, immortalized in The Imitation Game. Doesn't really look like Keira Knightley, but she was a very, very skilled cryptanalyst. She was actually recruited by Gordon Welshman. She didn't enter a crossword puzzle competition to come to Bletchley Park. She was a student of Welshman's. That's how she arrived at Bletchley Park. And Hugh Alexander wasn't a womanizer. He was not quite like the actor that played him in the film. But as I said, it was a Hollywood film. Now, the German Navy were much more security conscious. They didn't allow the operator to choose the three-letter message setting. They used code books for him that he would have to use to work it out. This thing called the Kenngruppenbuch, which was a book of what are called trigrams, 3 letters, random 3 letters, and something called bigram tables, where pairs of letters could be converted into other pairs of letters. Now, the German naval messages were similar to the Army and Air Force, except this preamble, they had this thing called the indicator, and the message setting is hidden in there. And this was really daunting to work out what the message setting was. Turing actually worked out how they were doing it within 2 or 3 weeks, but he couldn't replicate the books. They had to capture some. It was the only way they would make progress. These were actually embedded in the encrypted text, and they'd worked this out quite quickly. This is a real wartime message, just of interest, intercepted 27th of May, a message, German message telling various German naval people that Bismarck had been sunk. So, how did the operator sending the message tell everybody else what the message setting, because again, is now different. And again, this is way more complicated than the Army and Air Force. The operator would choose at random a trigram from the book, say ARK. He would then set the machine up to his daily key and he'd encrypt it to LVN. Now, LVN is going to be the message setting, so he needs to tell everybody else that he's chosen LVN. Now, this is a much more sophisticated way of doing it. He would choose another trigram, say YVT. Write them down like this. Choose 2 letters at random to create this pattern, and then use the bigram tables to change this pair of letters to those. And that is the indicator. And then at the other receiving operator did the reverse to recover the message setting. So this is a much more sophisticated process and created great problems for Bletchley Park until they captured the code books, which they eventually did. Now, the Enigma system had a huge weakness. The weakness was inherent in the system. It made it easier for the operators to use, and it's simply, you can't encrypt the letters itself. Press A, never turns A into A, B into B. They also had made an incredible number of mistakes. Probably a least known fact about all of this stuff is that the German Enigma operators all worked alongside a radio operator, and the German forces grouped radio operators together in what they called radio networks. Each radio network had its own daily setting of the Enigma machine, completely different settings. Gordon Welshman came up with a naming convention, started off with colors, so the main German Air Force was the red. When they ran out of color names, they used bird names, insect names. By 1943, Hut 6 was reading the traffic of over 140 networks, each with its own daily setting, and the maximum number of possibilities in each case was 158.9 million. You get a feel for what a daunting task it was. But that meant that somebody in Berlin had to work out all these message settings, and they got lazy. So, for example, they would use wheel settings from 2 separate keys to make the red key up. So if you knew these keys, you knew that key. Again, why would you do that? Because it makes your life easier. And there were all sorts of other mistakes. They would never put they would never use a wheel in the same position 2 days in a row. But if you've got 60 possibilities of scrambling the wheels in the machine, and on day one you know what was in position 1, you know it can't be there in position 2, it reduces 60 possibilities to 32. They made all these incredible mistakes. They thought they were improving the system, but they were actually making it more vulnerable to attack. So the point of attack after the Polish methods failed exploited the fact that Enigma could not encrypt the messages itself, and the fact that the Germans frequently repeated phrases. In this example, during the Battle of France, Britain was being attacked by the German Air Force from captured airfields in France. Every day, Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin would send to those airfields their targets for the day. The messages would be encrypted with the German operational key, the red key. The messages would always begin with the same phrase, which in English, special orders for the, and the name of that squadron. So every time that message was sent, it had the same phrase at the beginning. So you would write some of those characters on a strip of paper. You would write, this is the intercepted string of encrypted characters, and you start moving it around. Now at this position, we know this relationship can't be right, because if it was, it would have meant that the machine had encrypted E as E and N as N, and you can't do that on an Enigma machine. At this position, again, it doesn't work, because you can see you have that problem. But at this position, for each letter, there's a different letter below. So there's a chance that the operator has typed B and the machine has turned it into S. He's then typed D, turned it into F, etc. This relationship was called a crib at Bletchley Park, and it was the basis of the attack on Enigma. They produced these wiring diagrams called menus. I'm not going to go into any detail. This is a whole lecture in itself to explain how this worked. Interestingly enough, the use of the word menu is interesting. They eventually built a machine called the bomb. It wasn't a computer. It had computing-like properties, and this might be the first use of the word menu associated with a computing-like device. The reality is the name actually came from the fact that the cryptanalysts referred this was the menu that was fed into the machine, the diet that was fed into the machine, hence the word menu. As early as probably October 1939, Turing and Welchman were already thinking about how machines could be used. They came up with this idea of a machine. They approached a company called the British Tabulating Machine Company in Letchworth that turned into ICL after the war. The head of the team that built the things was this guy, Harold Keane. These are really the three people who can claim responsibility for the bomb machine. Here's a wartime picture of BTM's factory in Letchworth, turned over completely to making these things. And here's a picture of wartime bomb machine. Here's a close-up of the the drums, they called them, which emulate the wheels on the Enigma machine. Again, I'm not going into any detail about how this worked, simply to say that each column of 3 replicates the Enigma wheel on an Enigma, left wheel, middle wheel, right wheel. I won't say any more than that. Most of the bomb machines, there were about 211 machines by the end of the war. Most of them were not at Bletchley. The largest facility was at Eastcote in North London, about 120 machines there. The U.S. Navy and Army, actually, there are no pictures of the U.S. Army bomb. Turing went over and consulted on it. The National Register Company in Dayton, Ohio, built about 100 bomb machines, 1943-44, and here's a rare picture of the American Navy bomb, and there was complete collaboration between the British and the Americans in this work. Now, there was an awful lot of stuff that happened at Bletchley Park, which has residents today, quite extraordinary. These people, their ideas were amazing. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that American expression, a skunk works. Anyone heard that expression? In my view, Bletchley Park was arguably the world's first skunk works. They put together the smartest people in the country. They gave them money. They told them what the problem was, and they said, we don't care how you do it. There were no rules. You could do exactly what you wanted. If you could work out the daily key with a Ouija board, you could do it that way. Nobody cared. Nobody cared how you did it. So these people were actively encouraged to innovate. Their ideas went well beyond the technology of the day. So data mining, the fact that they recognized very early on that there was all this stuff in the message. It came that with encrypted message, which was not encrypted. So even if you couldn't decrypt the message, you could use this stuff to your advantage. Data search. Hard to believe that people were thinking about using data search in the 1940s. 1940s. So here's an example where an encrypted message on its own is of no use whatsoever. Every scrap of data that came into Bletchley Park was stored. All the wooden huts had boxes, index cards, and there was another type of technology used, which I'll mention in a minute. So here's an example which shows you how the message alone, even though you've decrypted it, tells you nothing. Here's the message, genuine wartime message, Air Force message. Here's how it appears after it's been decrypted. The intercept operator has missed a couple of letters, but if you look at this, if you know any German at all, that's pretty obviously going to be lieutenant or lieutenant, and you may be starting to meld that. Anyone that knows German words start to jump out at you. The analyst would start to split up the words, trying to identify German words. Eventually, they've even worked out, this is obvious Kel, so they'll find out what this guy's name is. Foggio, it was actually Foggia. It turns out the sending operator obviously misspelt it, a town in southern Italy. So here's what the message actually says. Lieutenant Kellner to report immediately to Foggio. Now what possible use can that be? One German Air Force officer being sent to Foggio. But every time a person's name appeared in the decrypted message that came into Bletchley Park, they created a record of this individual, and they would update it every time his name appeared. Here's his record card. They even know his first name, Lieutenant Gottfried Kellner. First appeared October 7, 1940. This was a group that he was identified with. 5th of the 3rd, he sent to Saint-Omer, which is in the north of France. This one here means he's reported an airfield ready for occupation. So they know what this guy does for a living. He goes to airfields that have been built and reports them ready for use. And now he's been moved to Foggia in the Mediterranean. Therefore, the intelligence report, which would have gone from Bletchley Park to the War Ministry and the Air Ministry, was that the Germans are opening up runways in the Mediterranean theater and moving aircraft there, which proved to be the case. Now, that intelligence was not possible from the decrypted message alone. So it's this use of data and cryptography together, which is key. Now, there was even the concept of big data, believe it or not, at Bletchley Park. It's a common phrase today. Huge amounts of data are being compiled. Now, when you're getting massive amounts of data, writing things on bits of card isn't any good. So the only technology they had in that era was Holloway punch card machines. That was the technology of the day, capable of doing anything. Processing these things, those of you that have been involved in computing, as long as I have, probably used these in the 1970s as computer data input. In Fortran, a real pain to use if you dropped your deck of cards. It was horrendous. You handed it in, and then a day later you'd get your output. So by the end of the war, they were processing over 2 million of these a week. 2 million a week. Just a phenomenal output. Here's a nice wartime picture showing the boxes and boxes of index cards. Here's one of the wings. This building is now the visitor center of Bletchley Park. Here's a wartime picture showing Holloway punch card equipment. Here's how it looks today, faithfully restored, except now it's a Bletchley Park's coffee shop. But apart from that, everything else, the original floor, windows, radiators, are all wartime. So just one simple example of how this technology was used. You recall that I said Naval Enigma had a real problem. The message setting was much more complicated to work out than the Army and Air Force. Now, one technique they used, which is really quite interesting, was called the Eins catalog. Now, Eins is a German word. Over 90% of German naval messages, believe it or not, contained the word Eins. Over 90% contained E-I-N-S. They would work out the daily key. Sometimes they captured the sheet, so they knew what the daily key was. So they would actually take a replica Enigma machine or Enigma machine, and they would type Eins in at every possible setting of the wheel. So they would do this for 17,576 positions, and they would build up this catalog and put onto punch, and then they would take a load of messages, maybe 1,000 messages, punch them onto Holloway punch cards, and then they would search looking for, in this case, HKHN, then they would look for IWPZ. If they found XKHN appearing in one of the messages, then there was a chance that that had been the message setting when that had been encrypted, and they would then start to work on other parts of the message, and that proved to be the case. They could work out the message setting. Now, you could not do that by hand, but the Holloway punch card equipment allowed them to do that very, very quickly. Again, this was one of the brilliance of Gordon Welchman. Welchman actually went to the Holloway punch card people and said, rather than what had happened before, where people were just asking to do specific tasks, Welchman was one of the first to go to them and say, this is the problem, what can your technology do to help? And the Holloway punch card people started adopting, taking their equipment and modifying it for cryptographic purposes. A great use of technology. Now, Enigma was pretty simple compared to this beast, the Lorenz cipher. Adolf Hitler did not use Enigma. They used this machine, the Lorenz machine, orders of magnitude more complex than Enigma, 12 encryption wheels, and it was based on the teleprinter. Again, I don't seem to have any audio, but you all know what Morse code sounds like, and people can listen to Morse code and write it down. This thing was teleprinter being sent over a radio. You could not write it down. It was indecipherable, so they needed another way. It was described at the time as a new kind of music that the operators were picking up. And it was based on the teleprinter. I'm sure most of you know what a teleprinter is. When you get younger people, you actually have to tell them what a teleprinter is because they have no idea. There's a device on the end of either end of a telephone line, and you can type on one end and it goes over the telephone line and prints out on the other end. Now, what they would do is they would feed it the signal through a thing called an undulator, and it would print the pattern on paper tape. Now, we're getting into the early days of computer type thinking. It's really a 5-bit binary code. Bletchley Park didn't use ones and zeros, they used crosses and dots instead. And believe it or not, a woman would look at this pattern and they would identify dots and crosses, or zeros and ones in binary, and depending on the width here of this trough, that would tell them how many ones there were, 1, 1, 2, or 3, based on the width. Incredibly difficult. And then when they would work that out, they would punch it onto 5-bit paper tape. And here's an example here. So if you're a binary person, think ones and zeros, okay? Here's a closer picture of the Lorenz machine, 12 encryption wheels. Each wheel has a unique number of positions, not like Enigma, where each wheel has 26 positions it can be set to. So hugely more complex. So here's how it worked. It used the properties of exclusive OR, if there's computer people in the audience. The operator would type a letter, say B. Here's its teleprinter representation. The encryption machine, Lorenz machine, say randomly generates a J. You add the two together. This is what you get. Again, it's a bit of exclusive OR. Receiving operator receives L. His machine set up exactly the same way, so it generates a J. In this world, when you add L to J, you get B. So it's German in and German out, and the operators don't need to get involved at all other than setting up the encryption machine and typing in the message. This was being used for 20, 30,000 character messages. If you try to encrypt or decrypt a 20,000 character message on an Enigma machine, the war would be over by the time you did one message. It would take forever. So this was quite a sophisticated system for the 1940s. And believe it or not, they broke it at Bletchley Park. Again, it was due to operator error. They were testing the system, 1941, August 41. Sending operator sent about a 4,000 character message. The guy at the other end received it, said, I didn't get all of that, can you send it to me again? And the sender sent the same message on exactly the same setting of the Lorenz machine, and he made things worse by abbreviating letters. So Bletchley, the police station in Denmark Hill in London intercepted this thing, sent it to Bletchley Park. 2 long messages, one 100 characters shorter than the other, but both encrypted on the same encryption key. This chap, John Tiltman, one of the great British cryptographers of all time, cryptanalyst. Tiltman was active until he was 80 years old. He went at Oxford when he was 13, arguably the greatest British cryptanalyst of all time. He, in about 2 weeks, actually worked out the text of both messages, and knowing the text, they could extract the stream of characters that had been generated by the Lorenz machine. It was eventually passed to this guy, Bill Tutt, 20-year-old mathematician, and about 6 or 8 weeks, Tutt managed to work out the logical design of the Lorenz machine based on this stream of characters. Quite a remarkable achievement, and then they could build replicas because they knew the logical design of the machine. Here's a wartime picture, and here's a modern replica of the Lorenz machine. They refer to it as the Tunny machine at Bletchley Park because the radio networks using it all had fish names, so hence the word Tunny. Initially, they broke the system by hand. There was a section called the testery, named after this chap, Ralph Tester. They worked it out by hand. In the early days, the Germans were very friendly. The 12 wheels each had a starting position. They would put the starting position of the 12 wheels at the beginning of the message unencrypted. Very helpful. And there were other aspects of the setup which were very simple. They obviously tightened security. They actually introduced a code book called the QEP book. So at the beginning of the message, it would say QEP 23. Sender and recipient would look that up in a code book, which the British never captured, and there would be the settings of the machine. So in the end, obviously, machines could help crack this machine. With the arrival of Max Newman, Turing's professor at Cambridge, arguably the one who inspired Turing to start thinking about computing machines, Newman set up a section called the Numenary. The first attempt at building a machine, the Heath Robinson name was appropriate. It struggled to achieve much. They approached the post office, and this gentleman, Tommy Flowers, he was asked to see if he could help, and eventually he brought a machine which was given the name Colossus to Bletchley Park. By the end of the war, there were 10 of these, arguably the world's first electronic computer, not programmable in any modern sense, doesn't have memory in any modern sense at all. But it worked. It didn't work out most of the time. All of the settings of the Lorenz machine, like the bomb machine, it worked out part of the setting, and they worked the rest out by hand. They could then set up their replicas and decrypt the traffic as it came in. Now, another hugely important thing that was developed at Bletchley Park, again, Gordon Welshman can claim credit for this, was really the birth of traffic analysis. Traffic analysis did take place in World War I, but not on any coordinated scale. Welshman brought all of the various groups in the country that were doing this sort of work and brought them all together to Bletchley Park. Because in this unencrypted preamble, there was some very useful information. Every radio operator had a call sign, typically 3-character things like P7J. The British had worked out the whole call sign system, so P7J might have been a radio operator with a Panzer division. And then using direction finding equipment, they could track that individual's movements around Europe. The discriminant defined the particular key that was used for that message. So again, this is really useful information. Today we call this stuff metadata. Not surprisingly, because the concepts around the use of metadata are resonant today. I only have to say the name Edward Snowden, and you'll know what I'm talking about. So you won't be surprised to know that all the post-war reports about traffic analysis at Bletchley Park are still classified to this day. Here's a picture. This is a GCHQ. This was the call sign book the German Air Force was captured, and they didn't change it. They carried on using it until about 1944. So I won't go into any detail how that works, but so the British knew all of the call signs of the German radio operators. HUT-6 traffic analysis was set up. It allowed them to work out the German disposition of troop forces and even the German order of battle. So hugely, hugely important. Arguably, traffic analysis was more important than cryptography. Probably much more came out of the traffic analysis than anything else. But the key thing to understand is that ultra-intelligence, the intelligence that was produced that assisted the Allied war effort, is a multifaceted thing. It isn't just the cryptography, data processing, direction finding, and traffic analysis. Combined, that's what made the output of Bletchley Park so powerful. Now, what was the impact? Well, Dunkirk is one of the early examples. Ultra decrypts revealed quite clearly that the British Expeditionary Force was in a desperate position. The reports went to the War Office, evacuate, 300,000 troops saved, in part due to the early warning by Bletchley Park that they were in a hopeless position. Clear evidence, 41-42, from ultra decrypts that Hitler had abandoned plans to invade Britain and intended to invade Russia, which obviously proved to be the case. El Alamein, Montgomery knew almost everything that Rommel was doing. He knew how much fuel he had, how many tanks he had. In fact, there's a legendary message which was sent from Berlin to Rommel in North Africa, and due to German delays, Montgomery went through the Bletchley Park process, and Montgomery got the intelligence before Rommel got the message. And that's a real example. And there were other examples where Allied commanders got intelligence reports about stuff before the intended German recipient got the message. It didn't always work that way, but when they were successful, they were phenomenally successful. And obviously the most important, I guess, D-Day decrypts ultra-intelligence, which clearly showed that Hitler at least clearly believed that the main invasion force was going to be at the Pas de Calais, not at Normandy. He held back tank divisions, didn't move them to Normandy. Hence, while still many Allied soldiers were killed or wounded, it would have been an awful lot worse. So there was confirmation from Bletchley Park that Hitler believed that. Now, in terms of finding out what went on, and the two key people, there's two biographies. One wonderful biography by Andrew Hodges of Alan Turing, my own about Welshman. People frequently ask me, who are the most important people? I think everyone is obsessed with lists, the 50 best this, the 100 best that. It's impossible to rank people, and I would never do that. So my standard response is there were lots of brilliant people at Bletchley Park, but these two gentlemen were fundamental to its ultimate success. And possibly one of the great triumphs of Bletchley Park was harnessing the technology of the day. I've already said that their ideas far exceeded the technology of the day, but they pushed technology to the limit. They understood how it could help, how you could end up doing signal intelligence on an industrial scale. And in fact, it was Welshman when Welshman published his own book in 1982. He didn't get approval, and it was Welshman's book called The Hut 6 Story, which first revealed how they did it, how the bomb worked, etc. He got into a lot of trouble for doing it because Welshman's thesis was that no cyber system, as we call it today, is secure from a concentrated industrial scale attack such as Bletchley Park undertook against the German signal intelligence system. And he was giving a warning. He was a consultant for the American Air Force, and he was worried that they were making the same mistakes. So that's a big message for you people interested in cybersecurity. Another Bletchley Park. When you're up against people, operating systems, there are vulnerabilities and a concentrated attack. That's what Bletchley Park teaches us. That's a historical lesson for us today. Right, I'll stop then. It just leaves enough time for some questions, but happy to take questions. But apart from that, thanks for listening. Hope it was interesting.
It's known that Turing was still working on cryptographic and similar problems with Manchester Baby. And one of those might have been the analysis in a slightly different area of the first hydrogen bomb trials, because potentially he was the only one capable of doing the maths with the computer in the country at the time. And one of his partners in crime, Neumann, was on the cover of a major magazine where he said, "I didn't build a bomb." And potentially that may have been a message for Turing, because he committed suicide shortly afterwards. Do you feel that if we had some of the San Francisco type get on the dirt that you alluded to, and Turing hadn't to wait 2 years, that he'd still be alive today?
Well, it's difficult to say. There's all sorts of rumors about Turing and what happened to him, and I certainly wouldn't speculate as to what happened to him, other than to quote a guy called Sean Wiley, who was a colleague at Bletchley Park, brilliant mathematician after the war as well. Wiley said that mathematics is a young man's game, and really raised the possibility that Turing was past his best work. From my knowledge, what he was doing in Manchester wasn't all that exciting. Yes, he was involved with the Manchester Baby, and he was writing computer manuals. He was doing some interesting stuff in photogenesis. So who knows, what Turing would have been able to contribute. One thing that many people don't know is that there is clear evidence in the National Archives that Max Newman, who moved to Manchester, became head of mathematics after the war and brought Turing there, arranged for 2 Colossus computers to be shipped to Manchester, and there's clear evidence that these 2 machines went to Manchester. The people there are still trying to track down what happened, but the historians at the University of Manchester believe that bits from wartime Colossus computers were in the Manchester Baby.
Thank you.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
There are Morse code symbols for umlauts. I was wondering if the Germans actually bothered with umlauts when they were...
Yeah, they did. They would put an E at the end after the letter. So A would be AE, etc. No, they used them. In fact, yeah, but I guess it was too difficult to make a 29 key machine. One of the problems with this stuff, you know, and the vulnerability of most cybersecurity systems, and it was the same problem in World War II and World War I, it's a compromise between it being usable and being secure. And obviously the Germans erred too much on the side of it being usable. Probably got time just for one interesting example. The thing which stumped this chap Dilly Knox in the early days was that they'd made a fundamental change to the Enigma machine. In the Enigma machine, it's based on currents, a battery, current running through the various electrical contacts in the machine. As you look at the machine, there are 3 wheels and they're wired up, but to the right of them, there's a thing called an input disk. And each key is wired to a contact point on the input disk. 26 keys, 26 contact points. That's all Enigma's got, A to Z. It's got no punctuation, it's just A to Z. Now, the early versions of Enigma, there was a very clear pattern on all of them that followed the order of the keys left to right and alphabetical around the disk. An Enigma keyboard is like a German typewriter, so it's QWERTZ rather than QWERTY. So the Q key was connected to A, W to B, E to C, etc. The German army, initially, then the Air Force, changed the connection pattern. And that's what stumped the British, because there are 26 factorial ways to do that. And they couldn't work out how they did that. So when Knox went to Poland and met Martin Rejewski, who had broken Enigma, one of the guys who had broken Enigma, his first question was, what's that connection pattern? Because unless you know that, you can't have broken Enigma. Rejewski didn't speak English, he was told the question, and his answer was A, B, C, D. They'd wired it up in the simplest possible way, the Q key to the Q contact, W to W, E to E, R to R. Clearly, it was easier to manufacture it that way, and it was the one way that they hadn't tried. That had stumped Turing as well as Knox. Thank you.